Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the new album from Perfume Genius, titled Too Bright. Okay, when you become a music critic, you eventually realize that outside of the generally accepted musical acts that everybody's expected to know, there's also a list of critically acclaimed independent singer-songwriters that are beloved to huge chunks of the critical public, but your average music fan, let alone the mainstream, will have never heard of the majority of these bands. And in this case, there's a reason why they've never received the slightest bit of mainstream airplay. They're weird, they write uncomfortable songs with offbeat subject matter. They opt for eclectic instrumentation or production that is used to enhance a song's atmosphere over what many people would deem traditionally accessible, or in some cases, listenable. In other words, they fall into a category that I like to call the Pitchfork-approved singer-songwriters, or PASS for short, indicative of the common and honestly frequently unfair response from everybody else upon first hearing them. Now, it may be hard for most to understand why critics love these acts, especially when they frequently display less polish, cohesion, or even less visible talent in comparison with most mainstream accessible acts. And this becomes a bit of a balancing act to sort out those who might deserve said critical acclaim and those who can just play to that critical audience's sensibilities exceptionally well without much beneath the surface. Now, Perfume Genius definitely falls into the former category. The stage name for Seattle-based singer-songwriter and Baroque pop artist Mike Hadrius, Perfume Genius broke into the indie scene with Learning in 2010, a gorgeously melodic record full of lo-fi fuzz, rattling pianos, and uncomfortably explicit songs that did not shy away from controversial subject matter. And I get why he got the critical acclaim that he did. Despite the fact that he wasn't a stellar pianist or singer, Hadrius brought a real warmth and raw honesty to his material that felt authentic and real and balanced the real darkness in his songs really quite well. Filled with the little details that set a very vivid scene and left plenty unspoken in the subtext, and yet implied enough to show that there really was that subtext. Now, the risk with this sort of material is that the quickest way to raise the stakes is to go darker, which can be an even trickier tonal balance to maintain. But Perfume Genius went in a different direction, and instead exposing more vulnerability and more complicated portraits on his second excellent album, Put Your Back Into It, a critically acclaimed release that wouldn't seem out of place in today's indie scene, with its cleaner production, focus on reverb, and heavier percussion. And like Licky Lee, who would follow him this year with I Never Learned, he made it work because of a continued focus on melody above all else, even as the instrumentation got slightly more diverse and eclectic. And with songs like the damn near transcendent title track, it's no surprise the album got a lot of acclaim. It deserved it. And now he's back with his third album, Too Bright. Would Perfume Genius be able to maintain his critically acclaimed streak and his impressive sound, even as the indie scene has gotten a lot more crowded with specific artists in his vein right now? Well, in a way he does, in that this album is goddamn fantastic. One of the best records of the year, and featuring some absolutely stellar songs from a performer who is maturing as an artist incredibly well. Is it perfect? No, but it might be my favorite Perfume Genius record because it feels the most expansive, intricate, and fully formed of any of his releases. And what I love about Too Bright by Perfume Genius is something wonderfully simple. It takes the vulnerability and the internal focus that characterizes his first two albums and flips it the other way. Instead of inviting us into his claustrophobic world, he's stepping out into our world and daring us to look him in the eye. So, let's start with Mike Hadrius himself. And really, what I've liked about him from the very beginning is all still here. Raw honesty that comes through in every quiver of his voice, this time bellied by a simmering anger that never quite explodes, but is always present. It's really impressive how intense some of the tracks on this album can be, given Hadrius' voice, because let's face it, without the benefit of pitch shifting, he does not cut a traditionally imposing figure behind the microphone. And oh, does he know that, and chooses to make up for it with every single trick in his arsenal, partially through raw charisma on tracks like Queen that owe something of a depth to Hedwig and the Angry Itch or the eponymous rock band, half through hazy, expansive vocal effects and a richly textured mix, and half through sheer power unlike anything I've heard from him before. It's incredible how much raw emotion he can wrench from his voice without destroying his voice on songs like Fool or My Body, while still coming across as incredibly poised. It's breathtaking. Now granted, his instrumentation and production definitely help. This album has been advertised as his most lush and expansive to date, and that's not wrong. Sure, you get the melodic and minimalist class of I Decline, the gorgeous shimmering keys and upright bass on Don't Let Them In, the beautiful wall of strings on No Good that gains the slightest hint of texture in its lower end as it fades back as musical punctuation, the sad timbre of the piano and strings on Too Bright has this high flutter in the crescendo, sends a chill down my spine every single time, to probably the most conventional song on All Along, with the washed out guitars that drops into the smooth yet very textured lounge vibe at the back half of the song that I really liked. But where this album gets interesting is where it expands its sonic palette to include harsher synthesizers courtesy of Portishead's Adrian Utley, dark snarls of distortion, and the impeccably crisp drums of John Parrish, most notable for playing with PJ Harvey. And what amazed me was how often this experimentation worked so damn well. At its mildest, the song Fool has a thick, mid-range synth against great snaps, drum work, and a steady, creaking bass thrum courtesy of Ali Chant, until the track changes mid-song for a glorious swell of restrained organ and shimmering synth makes you feel like you're standing in the eye of a hurricane. And that's the most normal of the songs. Queen has a more aggressive synth tone and gospel backing vocals, and features alternatively one of the best keyboard tones I have heard all year, or this primal shriek of distortion that perfectly fits the desperate drama of the song. And they only get darker from there. My body's all simmering bass as Hadrian's voice goes even deeper before erupting into this low gurgle of distortion that perfectly punctuates the shrill tone of his high distorted vocals before this chilling synth line slides into the upper end of the song that breaks into the squealing storm of booming drums and synth. And I honestly thought Swans made the most unnervingly demonic music of the year, because from there on Grid, Perfume Genius goes borderline industrial with his hollow low-end synth that wouldn't be out of place on an early Nin or Depeche Mode album before throwing in guitar screams, growling bass, spiky percussion, distorted child voices, and breathless howls that send a chill down my spine. It's terrifying. Now, there are only two instrumental experiments I don't quite think work all the way through on this album. The first being the synth choice on Long Pig. Just a little bit too icy despite the really great percussion line on that song. And the second is probably the weakest song on the album, I'm a Mother. A song intensely claustrophobic with Hadrian's thin voice pitch shifted down into the heaviness of the mix. Now, I don't tend to like pitch shifting as it is, and this song seems to feel just a little bit inert. It actively seems to make the lyrics impossible to distinguish outside of fractured fragments. And really, that's the worst thing you do when you have such a good songwriter on this album. So let's talk about some of the songwriting, shall we? Now let me start by stating my biggest nitpick with this entire album, and that is that there aren't any of the intricate stories that Hadrian used to sketch the vivid pictures of his life on his prior works. And their absence is intentional here, because this album is not really about him, at least not in the same way. While his neuroses and fears fuel this album's words, the vivid self-flagellation of the wordplay on this album, and make no mistake, it's often stark and really quite graphic. The origin of those fears is not located within, but driven by external forces. It adds reality to the undercurrent of rage lurking beneath several of these songs. On some songs, it's straightforwardly defiant, like Queen, a song that might seem to be rooted as both a gay anthem and a song that epitomizes the visceral, sexualized fears of every single homophobe. And that as much as he seems to take a fierce pride in all of his image, it also seems to show his intense discomfort in his own skin and his own body. And those songs like Don't Let Them In and My Body. And yet it's important to note that this discomfort comes not just from internal questions, but external pressures as well. Attempts to make him conform to something that would ultimately be easier on him, but yet would be dishonest of his true nature. And thus he rejects that conformity. The opening track is a prime example of that self-awareness, symbolized by the repeating phrase throughout the entire album, I can see for miles, declining the angel above the common grid and walking his own way. And if there's a real want from Hadrian on this album, it's simple and universal. He craves love on his terms and for his love to be reciprocated. That's what makes Fool such a really sad song, as his partner does not reciprocate that love and affection he obviously shows, something that Hadrian knows and considers himself a fool and a buffoon because he stays anyway. It's what makes the unrequited love of a partner ripped away by death on no good all the more heartbreaking, and he doesn't need to say the cause because it's well enough implied. And that's where we get to the crux of this album, as Hadrian has described the title of this album, describing all the good things he could have or could do to make his life easier, and yet he doesn't approach because of fear of the unknown. An interesting parallel, considering that many would make the argument that homophobes fear what they don't know and they don't understand. And yet he inverts this fear and refuses to be bound or held back by it because it's a waste of his time. He doesn't need their love or even their understanding of his choices or of his life. He just needs them to listen to him as he is, because that's where the real purity in his intentions lie. Ultimately, the theme of this album surrounds not succumbing to fear or self-loathing, recognizing that their roots are outside of himself. And while it might be easier to give in, it ultimately will prove that much stronger to stand secure in all of one's flaws and force the truth on those who would pass judgment that they themselves could not withstand in return. So if you can't tell by now, I love this album. I love that it's heartbreakingly human and real, vivid detail and stark shades. I love the melodic focus and the fascinating instrumental tonal choices that's willing to go force a dark atmosphere, not to accentuate the image, but to place it in stark contrast. I love the message at the end that is very confrontational, something you wouldn't typically expect from this particular form of art, but feels earned all the same from an artist willing to show painful honesty and a lot of self-awareness. In short, Too Bright by Perfume Genius is one of the best albums of the year, hands down, a 9 out of 10 and the highest of my recommendations. Folks, don't pass on this guy. This is some of the most terrifyingly melodic and beautiful music that you will hear this year, and it is definitely worth your consideration. So go check this album out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Hasn't been a little so long since I got really passionate about it now, but yeah, it's worth it. Go check this out. So yeah, if there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation or any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.